Hello and welcome, everyone. This book talk will be in English. We have a really nice two guests, women, brilliant writers, authors, knowers of literature, talking today about the wonderful book from Lithuania, Vilnius Poker, Vilnan pokeri in Finnish, written by Ričardas Gavelisin and published by Siltala last autumn at the end of the year. And here we have Jūratė Čerškutėa, who came from Lithuania who has written a PhD from Gavelisin's work and has researched his work for 15 years and know him very well and his work very well. And we have Sofi Oksanen, who will be discussing the book and the translation into Finnish with Jūratė. And Sofi Oksanen is probably a person that needs no introduction, so I hope you will enjoy this talk, and I hope you too will enjoy the talk as well.
Thank you. Kiitos. Hyvää iltaa kaikille kirjallisuuden ystäville myös siellä kotisohvilla. This conversation will be held in English, but if someone has questions, you are free to ask them in Finnish and later on. This book, I think it actually sold out when it came out last year, because people found out about this marvelous Vilnius poker, and also the novel introduced us new Lithuanian author, which Lithuanians, of course, know so well. The book is, I don't know what, because there's an excellent introduction to Gavelisin's work written by Jūratė in the novel. And you are saying that this is a difficult book. I don't think it's a difficult book. If you like a choice, then this is definitely for you. And if you like poetry, then this is also a novel for you. I think Kirkus Review had written, when the English translation came out, a very interesting and a good one, a positive one, review about Vilnius poker, and describe it as a matrix describing the world behind iron curtain. How would you describe the novel?
When Gavelisin started his literary career, before that he was physics. He studied physics, and he came to literature absolutely not from literary world. So in 1987 it was published one short story which was written about 1975. And the title of that story is a report about the ghosts. So I think this novel is something like that. It's like a report about living under Soviet occupation.
Indeed, it is about human experience in a totalitarian regime, and it describes very well the paranoid atmosphere in that world, and that makes it also very topical to today's readers. The novel came out in Lithuanian in 1989. It was the time of perestroika and the national movement as well. Lithuania, Soviet Lithuania at the time, was definitely marching towards regaining the independence. And the novel came a huge success at once. I think it sold over 100,000 copies.
Yeah, but it's a secret history about publication.
Yes,
Can I tell?
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. So how did it see the daylight?
You can see at the ending of the novel that Gavelisin wrote it in between 1979 and 1987. So he told that that censorship and that his books was not able to be published. Everything what was published till Vilnius Poker till 1989, Gavelisin wrote it till 1978. So it was 1979, and he started writing Vilnius Poker, and it was maybe the beginning of 1989 or maybe the end of 1988. He showed the manuscript of Vilnius Poker to his friend Aleksandras Krasnovas, who at that time was the only publishing house in Lithuania. Vaga, it was a government publishing house. So Krasnovas was the chief of prose department, and he read that novel. And at that time, as you mentioned, Lithuania was thinking about regaining independency, and we had going on that big movement, which is called in Lithuania Sąjūdis. And Krasnovas understand that this book, this novel, needs to be published immediately. Otherwise, if you are going through all that stages at that time in publishing, you have to put this book on the plan, and it means that it will be published after 2 or 3 years, and at that counting it will be 1991, so terribly too late for this book. So he didn't tell his superior chiefs about this book. Gavelisin gave one condition: you should publish this book as I wrote. I mean, I don't need any editing, and I'm not accepting it. Yeah, so on the first edition, it's written that it's edited by the author. And it was sent to publishing house. It was a few days after Baltijos kelias, Baltic Way. It was 1989, August 23rd. And so, when the power of a publishing house heard this news, they wanted to stop publishing process, but it was impossible because the book is already in print. And so that's how we have this absolutely wonderful miracle, because this book came out of the press, and it was launched about 2 weeks after Berlin Wall fall. So Berlin Wall fall November 9, and Gavelisin gave the first interview about novel November 25. So it's like, absolutely perfect timing. I mean, you can't plan like that.
And how was the reception?
First of all, it was called literary bomb, because maybe it sounds quite, I don't know, maybe strange, because this novel is the first novel in Lithuanian prose about modern city. It was in one of the first review, it was called like intellectual city prose, like, oh, finally we have novel which are set in city, not in village. It was, used to be in Lithuanian literature. And it was called literary bomb because we have city. We have portraying of woman and sex, even sex scenes. It was such a crazy story after publishing Vilnius Poker, that copied pages where are sex scenes. It was circulating in market. So it was such a crazy times, Lithuania trying to be independent, and it was crazy times. It was called like literary bomb, but at the same time it was understood as quite a powerful book, and I am a researcher of contemporary Lithuanian prose. So I think this book is like point from that we could count the history of contemporary independent Lithuanian prose.
Maybe in the audience there might be some younger people who might not actually know what actually Soviet Union meant for literature. So maybe you want to say a few words about, you know, what the censors accepted during the Soviet era, and what was different in Vilnan's poker.
Well, this book, you know, the main character, Vytautas Vargalys, is a survivor of Stalin labor camp, and he survived Gulag. So for censorship, it was impossible. I mean, you can't write about a Stalin regime. So one thing, and that character, when he came back after Siberia to Vilnius, he decided to research they. And it's a powerful metaphor of Gavelisin, and they mean not just Soviet Union, not just totalitarian. It's like universal metaphor of evil. As we said yesterday, mega evil, yeah? So, you know, doing such a things, it was absolutely impossible in Soviet times. I mean, you can't talk about regime. So censorship, yeah, and actually in Lithuanian literature, a novel at that Soviet occupation were, how to say, we're very strictly, I mean, looking at novels, because the characters should be very, you know, engaged to that regime and looking at bright future, you know. So this book is not about that.
Yes, this definitely is not. The people in the novel are not Soviet people, even though they have to live the Soviet life. Now, you said that the author didn't want any editing, but do you know what kind of writing process he did have? Because this is a very rich novel, and I, as an author, I would be very interested in knowing how did he actually write.
I would be interested to know that too. But you know, Gavelisin died 21 years ago, so I just can, how to say, reconstruct some things, because when he started to write this book, as I mentioned, it was 1979, and it was absolutely gray era of Brezhnev stagnation. And he, as I mentioned, he studied physics, and at that time, physics students were more engaged to art than, I don't know, Lithuanian philology students. So Gavelisin a few times have said in interview that I came to Lithuanian literature alone, angry, and have read many books, maybe more than, you know, writers. And at that time, if you wanted to be a Lithuanian writer, you definitely should go to Lithuanian philology studies. So that was such times.
Yeah, physics was at the time popular amongst people who didn't want to go to study political subjects, or like history, even actually languages, all the so-called normal interests for a future aspiring author, they were too political if you had a sane mind, so to speak. Of course, I mean, there was at the time some compulsory communist subject as well, but physics was definitely less political, or it was not considered political in the same way like history or philosophy or literature, for example, at the university. So in that way, it makes sense.
Yeah, and Gavelisin said that, you know, it was more, how to say, free, more freedom in that community, because physics were studied together with mathematicians. And at that time, we were reading like Joyce, as we can see in this book, Joyce, Kurt Vonnegut. So what wanted to say that Gavelisin had a very good friend who, after studying physics, chose to be a painter. And Gavelis and that friend, we lived together in Vilnius. And we used to send letters to each other. And in that letters, which is in Gavelis archive, Gavelis write a bit about, process. And he said that he was very interested in a problem of narrator. It was the main problem for him in literature. And he was asking his friend, when you paint, do you think about narrator in the painting? So, that narrator problem. And when Gavelisin said, okay, now I understand that Vilnius poker will be Rashomon. So we have now to talk about structure. So Rashomon is a narrative structure, and this novel is a 4-part novel. And every part has a different version of the same events. And this narrative structure, Gavelis, as I say, borrowed from Japanese writer Ryonosuke Akutagawa. It was a short story called In a Groove. And the fabula is like there is dead samurai and going testimonies, and each witnesses tell a different story, and we don't know who killed the samurai. And the same story is in Vilnius Poker, where one detective's question, who killed Lolita Žalytė Banienė. And if you're following, you can have 4 different versions who the killer is. But it's not a detective story, it's just one of the layers of the novel.
Plus, I think Lolita is more like a allegory as a woman. There are very... I'm curious to know your opinion, because I have a feeling that almost all women are kind of allegories in the novel. And men are like full-bodied characters. So or they see women as allegories.
Yeah, we could, and there are a lot of questions about portraying a woman. Actually, I haven't, till this journey to Finland, think about that, because my dissertation was about deconstruction in Gavelis prose. But I think the answer is why Vargalis treat women like it treated in, I think, because, he survived the Gulag. And he had that torment, physical, by that, I don't know how to say, camp chiefs or whatever. And that's how deconstructed, affected how he see a woman, how he sees life. And that's how he can't have true love relationship. That's the problem for him, I think.
Yeah, and it says already, because the woman is Lolita and slash Lilith. Yeah. So in that way already, giving the name to the woman who is tormenting the men gives a hint of what the women are representing, life and death in general, or they might be even considered like symbols for life and death, actually. These evil powers that follow people in the novel, that are called they, do you know, or can you track down, how did he come up with this way of writing about totalitarian regime, or referring them as they? I mean, it makes sense, but I mean, do you know that if he had other solutions how to describe the security services?
No, I don't know. But all the time after, even after Soviet occupation, all his 7 novels, of course, in different ways, but speaks about power. I mean, how power can change man. And in his last novel, we see the main character is some kind of Lithuanian president, which, has a lot of power. And that's, the main idea, which was so important to Gavelisin.
And the fact that the protagonist has been in the camp, that this makes the book also part of a Gulag literature. But when you think about all possible Gulag books, then this is unusual when you think about the style. Most of the Gulag books are somehow memoirs.
Yes.
And this again makes you doubt about your memory, actually, because, of course, as the main character doesn't actually know what's true or not, who's following you or not, which are the powers who are actually affecting your life. So in that way, and that actually makes this also more topical as well, because I started also to think about, our modern very secure world with all security cameras, actually, which is not the feeling I actually would get from, Gulag memoirs, for example. So in that way, this is a good example also of a book that, or maybe only a sign of a good literature is that, it speaks to readers after one generation after another. Do you know, when you think about the Lithuanian prose as such, then does he have followers?
Actually not.
No?
No.
Okay.
Gavelisin, as I said, he came alone, and he always was standing alone and in distance in Lithuanian literature.
What do you think, why? Or did he think that he was somehow, literally mentally elsewhere?
Could be, but I don't know, maybe he was very, critical to everything, especially in the first years of independence in 1991, 1995. And actually, in 1992, Gavelisin started to be a columnist to one of the main papers at that time in Lithuania. So he became like a politician, a journalist or something like that. So he was always, actually in one of the last interview, he died, unlucky. Death. It's not like any time, but he died a month before Frankfurt Book Fair. And in 2002, it was very important because the first time Lithuania was the guest of Frankfurt Book Fair. That book is the biggest book in the whole world. And Gavelisin suddenly died on 19th August. And he gave interview before death to that short movie, which was being prepared for a book fair. And he said, all my life I was contra mundum. And he was doing that all the time.
Yeah. Okay. So, if you now think about what's happening, if he is a lonely one, then if you think about Lithuanian literature in general, how would you describe about the current themes, or is there some common factor in what's common in Lithuanian literature
Right now?
Yeah.
Well, I think now we are having autofiction moment because it's popular in the whole world. And we have some reflections about actually the same time, about 1990s. Yeah. We're having books about that, what was life in the first years of independence.
Okay, I don't know, and I'm not going to ask how old are you, but I mean, do you remember when the book came out? Did you remember?
Yes, I remember, because that book was really event, and the first edition was 50,000 copies, and it was the end of November. And at the end of January, I mean after 2 months, it was signed to second edition, and it was 35,000. And I remember that because that book was circulated somehow secretly. And I remember that my parents got this novel from, friends, and we were doing readings in the night or something like that. So yeah, I do remember. I was quite a little, but I remember that effect.
Actually, this reminds me of Estonian documentary. Maybe someone has seen it, Disco and Nuclear War, when people were, how people at the time, for example, watched Emmanuelle from Finnish TV, and also how those who could watch Finnish TV then told the others who were living outside the range of the Finnish TV, telling about Dallas and Dynastia, and then they were having these conversation groups where one person is telling what had happened in the in the last episode, and how the old family is coming, like they recreated actually the story in this way.
Yeah, I know.
And this is because it's an excellent documentary. That I was actually thinking that publishing Vilnius Poker would actually make a great movie. Mm-hmm. Then what about? Okay, I was hoping that he would have followers, but maybe the next generation. You don't think so?
Yes, Gavelisin had that character. He was quick to write and to reflect what's going on right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe you can tell more as a writer. I think it's quite difficult, because if you are writing about nowadays, you can have you can be criticized like, oh, it's not literature, it's journalism. And actually, Gavelisin was always criticized about that. It's not literature. I'm talking not about Vilnius Poker, because he was writing for quite a long time. This book, it was Soviet times. He was doing nothing. But when Lithuania regained the independence, so he started to publish books two years after 2 years, and it was such a quick writing, but writing about nowadays, what was at that time present, and the criticism was like, oh, Gavelisin is not writer anymore, he's like journalist or something like that.
Okay, then I have to say that I'm a bit sorry for the author not being alive like today, because because if you think about the success of Norwegian author Knausgård, then that was his project actually to document, everyday things, everyday moments. And which turned out to be a huge success. So maybe if the Vilnius Poker had been published today, then of course it wouldn't have the same impact on Lithuania in the same way as it was before. But then it would have been definitely considered like a literature.
Yeah, but Knausgård documented his own life, and Gavelisin was interested in Lithuanian life, government, what they're doing, or how we have economic crisis or something like that. So, but he had such a crazy thing. If you will read this book, the first part is set on October 8th. And it's the birthday of Gavelisin. So he put his biography, some moments in the characters, and through his whole literary life you can see that, but he was not very open to speak about himself.
But why did you get interested in researching Gavelisin?
Very good question. Well, you know, I came from a family which are engineers, medics, technocrats, and I'm like crazy philolog. and well, I was tired in the end of the studies. I was tired of poetry. And when, you know, I saw themes for baccalaureate diploma, and I saw, oh, Gavelis, I can write about it. So it was 2007. I wrote the first, research project about Gavelis. And I definitely felt that this is my author. He has a very strict structure. Not Vilnius Poker, every single novel, very good structured, and I liked that. And I don't know, when I was thinking about dissertation, I just knew that I should write about Gavelis. It was 7 years after his death at that time, and I understand that nobody researching Gavelis. Yeah, I'm still the only one who talks all the time about Gavelis.
Now this is interesting because, you know, he was a lonely guy in Lithuanian literature, and now you, as a researcher,
I'm a lonely girl. Yeah.
Okay, then I'm not going to ask. So how is the follow-up of his work in literary research? I'm not going to ask. Or maybe you will have followers then.
I don't know, but, you know, I'm trying to inspire. My mission in this life is to tell about Gavelis such interesting things that, you know, people would be interested to read.
Now, speaking of interesting things, one of the interesting things is, of course, the language itself. And he's very inventive with words. Mm-hmm. Now, you have followed his work. So what could you tell us about how he creates words?
It's very, pleasure for me to hear that about language, because in Lithuania all people, you know, talk like, oh, Gavelis, good structure, good themes, but not a good language. So it's
why?
I don't know, but for me, especially the language of Vilnius Poker is very good. And I can see that Gavelis wrote this book, was writing this book for 8 years. And it was, you know, he didn't have like freelancer jobs, but he was just sitting and writing. And he put everything, I think he knew about regime. And it was interesting because when we look back to the chronology of Memoirs of Gulag, the first one was published in Lithuania in 1988. It was the famous one, Dalia Grinkevičiūtė, Lithuanians by Laptev C. And I understand that Gavelis already had written about that, because Vargalys was in Gulag and so I think he was like a pioneer, avant-garde man in Lithuanian literature. He was doing everything before the moment, before the time.
Now we have also the translator. I have a question for the translator about translating the words, because what do you, I mean, because you become a creator yourself. If an author is inventing words, then how is the translating process?
Well, first of all, I'm not a native speaker in Finnish language. I studied Finnish language, and I actually translate from Finnish into Lithuanian. And the story of how this novel came to Finland deserves probably a separate discussion. But the process itself, because it was kind of a reverse process for me, so I have years of experience of translating literature and translating fiction and non-fiction works of various kinds, works of Sofi Oksanen herself. But this was a reverse project and reverse process, and we did it with another translator, Per Landsman. So from the very beginning, it was clear to me that I cannot do it myself because I'm not a native speaker, and it's a strange process, and it's something that you learn a lot from because. First of all, there are two people involved in the process, so there's a lot of back and forth going on. I translate and I send a text to Per, who reads the translation and does the first kind of corrections to translation. He sends it back, then I read, and then I correct him to where he got the things wrong. But there's also a lot of kind of word searching in a different manner than you do it in your native language. Meaning that when I see words in Finnish, I recognize whether they fit or not. I do know what they mean. But when you translate into Finnish, you don't always know those words, or you don't always remember them, and it's very hard to search for them. And it's really strange that before starting the translation, I was convinced that exactly these words that Gavelisin invents, for example, because he does invent all kinds of like kanuks and a lot of words that he does invent in Lithuanian language. And the other translator and editor actually, and the publisher had to check every time whether it's actually something where you just made a mistake or is it something that the author invented. But it wasn't actually the hardest part, and I think it's because the nature of the Finnish language that it's actually quite easy to invent words and kind of modify words in Finnish language. But the hard part was to kind of sometimes the most simple things, the way people sit. You realize that there are a lot of things that you never speak about because they're such visual things, and all of a sudden you have to write how somebody's sitting with their hand in some way. And I literally had, when looking for words, or there's a specific word that is, I don't know, like hovering, but it's a different word, and I would write a whole long comment to the other translator that I'm looking for a word that is kind of like floating, but it's in the water, and it would go on and on until we would find the right word. So it was at certain points it was a very, very long kind of back and forth, and then of course the language itself and the rhythm, what you I think mentioned, and Gavelisin does have and I think it's very, very important. In the book, and especially in certain parts of the book, the third part, which is basically the stream of consciousness, it's something where you have to get the rhythm. The very famous part about this jazz concert that is happening in kind of this abandoned church, and it's, I don't know, 5 pages of basically it's probably one sentence or 2 sentences. So rhythm is very important in these cases, and this is something that I think we thought a lot, and we went back and forth, and we had certain arguments with translator that I say that this has to be, I know it's a strange formulation, but it has to be like that, and kind of overtalk him and say that it will work, just trust me. But also his kind of experience and his ear, and also being the strange time of the pandemic that we actually didn't really meet during the whole time of translation. So it's a lot of writing to each other and kind of going, a lot of writing.
Well, obviously all your writing was worth it because the translation is exquisite, and now when I have talked about inventing words, then I have to say that they really fit. He creates language, even though you do understand, okay, now there is something that the author might have created, but it's not something you wouldn't understand. It's definitely something you feel like, of course. Of course.
And I think now that you're speaking, I'm actually thinking that maybe sometimes for the ones who are not native speakers in Finnish, it's maybe even easier to invent words, because even when I speak Finnish in daily language, I sometimes invent words that don't exist, but I think that they do exist. So this is something that I think for us, maybe I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's just a certain kind of I have worked with text and with language for years now, so it's something that you also can kind of train yourself, I think, a little bit in how you think about words. But it's also, it's a little nerdy thing in a way, because it's also about, it's just thinking about words, and you would spend days thinking about certain word and how to find that precise word that you're looking for.
Now, going back to the reception of the novel, have you followed the reception in different countries? In a way that, how does the work speak to audiences in different countries?
A little bit. I checked the English translation, and actually 11 years ago I was in the United States, and I had such an interesting discussion. There were Americans who read that book, and they said, "Oh, it's such a good fiction world, it's phantasmagoria, but it has nothing to do with reality." And at the same time was I, and together with one man, Polish man, who escaped the communism in Polish in 1980s, and he said very angry, like, "Oh, you don't understand nothing. Yes, it's fiction, but the real life was much harder when it's written in this book." So, Polish one, because in 2019 it was published translation into Polish language, and Polish people, they do understand everything exactly as it's written.
I have had same kind of experiences myself as well with my work. I can imagine that the carnal world, or the sex and the violence in the novel, might be, something new to readers in the beginning of 90s or end of 80s, but for a modern reader it feels like it's not shocking at all. It feels rather normal in this world, but to me the description of how totalitarian regime affects people feels very much up to date. I was also thinking quite a lot about China, actually, as I said, that this, because of, not because of personal experience, but because of this idea of monitoring. I mean, China is the master in monitoring people, so that's why I was thinking that they are indeed. I mean, if this was located or set in China, then we probably wouldn't even talk about paranoia.
It's very interesting, because I haven't thought about China. Of course, I'm thinking about Russia right now when the war is going on. And actually, when I read this book last summer before writing introduction, when I was reading everywhere, I was seeing Putin face. So, I mean, what Gavelisin wrote in this book, how they act, we can see that in everyday news about Ukraine.
Yeah. And I think this is a good words to end our conversation. Unless someone has, you have something in mind that I didn't understand. Ask or
No, I just want maybe to add a quick replica on the memory when you were talking. Okay. About but you can't how to say And this book, because when I was talking about Rashomon structure means that we have unreliable narrator and the same unreliable character. So it means that memory is unreliable. So
and also the concept of time is of course interesting, because the novel is set in October in 1970s, but at the same time throughout the book you can the Vilnius and the centuries before are present somehow all the time, and the city is present, and all the layers of time as well.
Yeah, and I think it's very good that we are talking about this book in 2023, because this year is like 700 years for Vilnius, and we are celebrating all the time, all the year, this birthday of Vilnius. So this book actually is the first one of Gavelisin, in which Vilnius is the main character, and he's like director of all the characters, how they move through the city. And I think this book created a contemporary mythology about Vilnius.
Which means also that it is a very good travel guide if you want to travel to Vilnius. I think so. So do read the book, lukekaa kirja. Thank you. Kiitos.
Thank you.